Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise just to make a few brief comments about the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Bill of 2016, and I do so as a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which considered this bill in detail and indeed engaged with not only the industry players that Senator McKim has just referred to, but also the government agencies that came before the government, highlighting the requirement for this legislation. The first thing I'd just like to point out, particularly following Senator McKim's points, which go very much to the ideology of the Greens in opposing any attempt by the government to make sure that our community continues to be safe, is his conflation of two issues. He mentions on a number of occasions data retention, as though this bill is intending to extend or somehow change the data retention requirements. In actual fact, the intent of this bill is to better manage national security risks to the telecommunications networks from espionage, sabotage and foreign interference. And so what the bill is looking to do is to extend the work that Australia has been doing with industry over a number of years to make sure that the systems that we rely on, whether it be industry in their own business, the general public, government, our security agencies, all of us now are enabled through data, whether it's on your mobile phone or computer networks in your office. Data and telecommunications is essential. And if we are to remain secure, both economically in terms of espionage, secure from a national security perspective in terms of espionage against state, as in government, information and secrets, then we need to make sure that the system that transports that information is secure. And so the one reference in this bill to data retention is not about expanding and duplicating the scheme. The intent of it is saying if in your data retention obligations you have offshored or you plan to make changes, you need to advise the government of the fact that you're making changes to a regime which is critical, a critical part of our national security infrastructure. And so there's a deliberate attempt by the Greens in this debate today to conflate these two issues. This bill is about making sure that the whole network that we all rely on is and remains secure, and in fact the evidence taken by the PJCIS and consequently our recommendations go to address some of the concerns that have been raised around things like the transparency of information, the degree of communication from government to industry. And so our recommendations say if government becomes aware of a particular threat that industry should be taking cognizance of and acting to prevent an intrusion or a weakness in our telecommunications system, then government needs to be sharing that information more transparently with industry. And so, in actual fact, this bill is about increasing the amount of cooperation and transparency between government and industry to make sure that when we see threats, we work with industry to address them. When industry make changes to their networks, to the physical architecture, to the contractual arrangements that might expose Australians' information to threat, that they advise government of that so that we can collaboratively work on keeping Australians safe. Now, my colleague Senator McAllister has stepped through a number of the details of the bill, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. There has been a bipartisan position reached on this. I do just want to highlight the fact that there are two key elements where this government has been working, and by and large in bipartisan cooperation with the opposition, to make sure that Australians remain safe. And that's in terms of national security and the counter-terrorist threat in particular, but also from the economic perspective. To start with the latter, Lloyd's, one of the world's largest insurance companies, estimates that the threat to the Australian economy is in the order of $16 billion over the next decade from cyber attack and espionage. We are under constant cyber attack from particularly international players, also potentially some domestically. Sydney actually ranks 12th of the world's major financial centres in terms of the degree of risk, and it's around $4.8 billion is the potential loss if cybersecurity is not taken seriously. And whilst companies can take individual steps, the network upon which data is passed is key in terms of making sure that that data is safe. If you'll know the particular company, take all the measures they like, but if the pathways upon which that data is transmitted are not secure, then all the efforts an individual company may have made come to naught, which is why we are focused on making sure from an economic perspective that the networks are secure, and hence this bill to increase the security framework of our telecommunications networks. The recommendations made by the committee were particularly to address some of the concerns that were raised by industry during the hearings, and the government has chosen to accept all of the recommendations from the committee, and they form the basis of what is before the Senate today. On the national security side, the integrity of our system, our telecommunications system, is important, not only to stop intrusion, but also for things like the data retention provisions. Data retention has been used for many years in Australia, and it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with child pornography, organised crime, or indeed terrorism. It is one of the most important tools that our law enforcement agencies have. And so as we look back and we congratulate our agencies on the 13 significant disruptions that they have had of plots to conduct terror, as we look at the fact that since 2014 more than 70 people have been charged as a result of 31 counter-terrorism operations around the country, that comes down to the fact that the government, and again in cooperation with the opposition, has passed through 8 major tranches of legislation to give our law enforcement agencies the tools that they need to respond in a timely manner to a rapidly evolving threat. And you can see that globally, but even here in Australia, that over the last 4 or 5 years, we have gone from a period where terrorist plots were largely a network of people with a coordinated and complex plot that our agencies could engage with over a period of months in terms of surveillance, collecting evidence before acting, to what we see globally and even in Australia is terrorist plots can be very simple, very quick, low-tech, and so the agencies' laws that they require to both obtain intelligence but also to be able to act to secure and keep Australians safe has changed. And so this government has passed through 8 significant tranches of legislation, including the Criminal Code Amendment, the High Risk Terrorist Offenders Bill in 2016, and that was passed to allow the continued detention of high-risk terrorist offenders. And I think the reasonable person in the street would agree that if somebody has not renounced the ideology that made them a risk in the first place, then we would be foolish to be releasing them back onto the streets while they still posed a risk. The Criminal Code Amendment, War Crimes Act of 2016, was passed to enable the ADF to legally target members of arms groups such as ISIL in Syria and Iraq. We had the ridiculous situation where some domestic law was preventing the effective engagement and destruction of an enemy that is sworn to Australia's destruction, that's been committing genocide in parts of the world. And so we have passed legislation to make that possible for the ADF to be effective. The Counter-Terrorist Legislation Amendment Act of 2016, lowering the age limitation of control orders to 14-year-olds. Why? Because we're seeing people as young as that carrying out both preparation and the actual conduct of terrorist acts, and our community rightly expects that we will give our agencies the powers that they need to deal with the threat that is evident, that is here today. The Australian Citizenship Amendment, Allegiance to Australia Bill, was passed, providing for the revocation or renunciation of citizenship of dual nationals convicted of or engaged in terrorism-related conduct. Probably the most frequent comment I have had from men and women in the community in Australia when I have gone to various functions is if somebody is engaged in terrorist acts against Australia, why do we allow them back into the country? Why do we keep them here? And so this Act made it clear that where somebody has dual citizenship and their actions have essentially renounced that citizenship by taking terrorist action against Australia, that Australian citizenship will be removed, and that has occurred. The Telecommunications Intercept and Access Data Retention Act of 2015, again, that was responding. It's not a new power. There's been data retention for many years. But what we found is with the changing commercial environment, where people no longer needed to retain the kind of information that said person A picked up a phone and rang for 15 minutes for billing purposes, because that's how telcos used to bill. They'd look at your telephone record and they'd charge you for the calls you made. Now that the commercial world has moved on through much more internet-based protocols to packages where you buy up front, they have no commercial need to retain much of that information. And yet that information is critical, as I said, whether it's child sex offences, whether it's organised crime and drugs or it's terrorism, it's critical to our law enforcement agencies. And so that bill was largely not about creating new powers, it was about preserving one of the most effective tools that our agency has. In 2014, the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment was passed, enabling ASIS to assist the ADF in relation to terrorists and updating and expanding the control order regime to apply to enablers. And so common sense measures that says if an Australian citizen is overseas and is doing something to the detriment of Australia, our interests or our allies, then ASIS can help the ADF, and that people here who are enabling and preparing for an act are people that we should be able to engage with as opposed to those who are actually in the act of committing a terrorist offence. The Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Foreign Fighters Act of 2014 was passed to respond to the threat of Australia's engaging and returning from conflicts. And then finally, the National Security Legislation Amendment Act of 2014. Now, the reason I run through those is that they have been passed on a bipartisan basis in the Parliament in the interests of the Australian public. And I make no apologies for those bills. The government's first priority is keeping Australians safe. And this most recent bill, whilst not directly a counter-terrorist bill or directly a counter-espionage bill, goes to the integrity of our telecommunications and data systems, which provide a vulnerability if we don't keep them secure. And that vulnerability goes to both terrorism-type offences, national security, as well as our economic security through cyber attacks. And so I just encourage people who are interested in it to download the PJCIS report, where we go through both the submissions and the government's submissions in detail as to why the bill's required. This piece of legislation is implementing the recommendations of the PJCIS, but I particularly just wanted to highlight that the ideological objection of the Greens is misplaced, specifically in regard to this bill, because it's not about increasing data retention powers. It's about saying if a telco has an obligation under the data retention regime and they choose to change the nature of their network, they need to advise the Commonwealth so that we can have a sensible discussion around what the implications of that are. I'm very happy to support this bill and commend it to the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett.